Over the years, I've seen countless families miss the earliest signs of dementia, not because they weren't paying attention, but because they were looking for the wrong thing. What if the first warning signs had nothing to do with forgetting names or losing track of time? What if it started much earlier, with subtle, strange shifts in personality, so quiet, so odd, even seasoned doctors might overlook them? Imagine this. Someone you've known for decades starts behaving just a little different. Not forgetful, not yet, but off. Their smile feels rehearsed. Their words sound borrowed. The warmth in their voice is replaced by something too polite, too formal, too unfamiliar. It's not dramatic, but it's enough to make you pause, to wonder. According to new research, these quiet behavioral shifts can begin years before any memory problems show up. They're like whispers from deep inside the brain, gentle at first, then growing louder as damage spreads. And here's the truth. The longer they're ignored, the more irreversible that damage becomes. But the earlier we recognize these changes, the more power we have to slow things down, to support our loved ones, and to prepare while there's still time. In this video, you'll discover 9 of the strangest, most overlooked personality changes that may be the very first signs of dementia. They're unsettling. They're easy to miss. But spotting them early could give you, or someone you love, a critical head start. Let's dive in, because the first sign might be something so subtle, so strange, that you've seen it before and never realized what it meant. Speech balloon. And if something in this video resonates with you, or reminds you of someone you care about, leave us a comment. Your stories help others feel less alone. Backhand index pointing right. If this resonates with you, please hit subscribe. We post honest, science-backed tips each week to help you care better, live stronger, and age smarter. Together, we share honest, science-backed tips every single week to help you care better for yourself and for the people you love. 1. The echo effect. When seniors start copying others without realizing it. Have you ever watched a loved one, someone who used to have a strong sense of self, suddenly begin copying people around them? Maybe it's the way they talk, the expressions they use, or even the style of clothes they wear. At first, it may feel like a funny little quirk. But what if that mimicry starts becoming a daily habit? This kind of unconscious imitation, especially when it comes from someone who never used to behave that way, can be the brain's silent alarm. What you're seeing could be a neurological shift, specifically in the frontal lobes, where personality, judgment, and awareness live. And when those areas begin to weaken, the ability to distinguish oneself from others can quietly fade. It's almost like a mirror reflecting everything around it, but forgetting where the frame ends. Brain doctor's insight. This is a common early sign of frontotemporal dementia. It isn't something your loved one is doing intentionally. Their brain is struggling to maintain a sense of self. Eyes watch closely for repeating phrases they recently heard on TV. Sudden urge to buy things others have. Mimicking accents, hand gestures, or walking styles. Bell lesson. Identity isn't just about memory. It's also about the quiet consistency in how we speak, dress, and move. When that begins to shift without explanation, it's time to listen to what the brain is trying to say. Right arrow next. Discover the hidden signals behind being too polite, and why it may be more than just good manners. 2. The overpolite mask. When kindness becomes a clue. Imagine your laid-back dad suddenly thanking the grocery clerk 4 times in one sentence, or your fun-loving grandmother switching to ultra-formal language with the grandkids. Instead of calling them sweetheart or buddy, she now says sir or ma'am. At first glance, it might just seem like a generational thing. But in truth, this switch can be the brain's way of grasping at structure when social instincts start to slip. The ability to read tone, mood, and context is delicate, like background music guiding a conversation. And when those cues get lost, formality becomes a coping tool. It's like defaulting to a script when you no longer know what's expected. Brain doctor's insight. This often shows up in semantic dementia, which affects language and emotional comprehension. It's not rudeness or overcompensation. It's confusion masked as courtesy. Eyes what to notice. Excessive thank yous or apologies. Speaking with stiff, overly respectful tone to close family. Avoiding slang or humor they used to enjoy. Bell lesson. When social warmth is replaced by stiffness, it may be the brain's way of trying to stay afloat in an ocean of fading signals. Right arrow coming up. The strange shift when a senior becomes obsessed with rules and justice turns into obsession. 3. The rule enforcer. When everything becomes black and white. We all know someone who likes things just so. But what happens when that attention to detail becomes a crusade? A neighbor places the recycling bin a few inches too far to the left, and it sparks a heated phone call. Someone parks on the street overnight, and it feels like a betrayal. When small irritations become moral offenses, the brain may be slipping into rigidity. As we age, the brain's prefrontal cortex, the seat of empathy, emotional regulation, and flexible thinking, can start to shrink. This can make seniors see the world in absolutes, right or wrong, black or white. Context? That's the first casualty. Brain doctor's insight. Early-stage Alzheimer's and frontotemporal dementia can both trigger obsessive thinking around justice, fairness, and social rules. Eyes red flags. Calling authorities over minor issues. Losing sleep over unfair treatment. Repeating the same complaint or grievance over and over. Bell lesson. If a loved one starts battling over every little rule, it may not be stubbornness. It may be a brain that's losing its grip on nuance. Right arrow don't go anywhere. Up next, when laughter doesn't match the moment and the emotional compass begins to falter. 4. The inappropriate smile. When joy doesn't match the moment. Now, this one is unsettling. Picture a loved one smiling at a funeral or giggling when hearing sad news. It might feel cruel or just off. But the truth is far deeper and more tragic. The brain's ability to connect emotion with expression lives in the frontal and temporal lobes. When those areas degrade, the person can no longer sync what they feel inside with what they show outside. It's like laughing in a dream that's actually a nightmare. Brain doctor's insight. This mismatch is one of the clearest red flags of frontotemporal dementia. The signals are scrambled, and so is the emotional response. Eyes clues to spot. Laughing during serious conversations. Lack of empathy or appropriate sadness. Odd or robotic emotional reactions. Bell lesson. An unexpected smile isn't always a sign of denial. It could be the result of emotional circuits short-circuiting. Right arrow, and by the way, if you found this video helpful so far, or know someone who needs to hear this, leave us a comment and hit that subscribe button. It helps us help more people like you. Right arrow coming next. When one person becomes the entire world. Clinginess that reveals a deeper fear. 5. The shadow of dependency. When one person becomes the whole world. It starts with needing a little help around the house. But then, slowly, you notice something else. A parent who used to be independent now trails behind you, room to room, clings to your side at family gatherings, or becomes visibly distressed when you step away. At first, it may feel like a tender moment, but this kind of clinginess can be a deeper signal, one the brain is whispering through behavior. As dementia progresses, especially in vascular or mixed types, it doesn't just affect memory. It begins to fracture emotional independence. The brain, struggling to process the chaos of daily life, will often anchor to the one person who still feels predictable. Brain doctor's insight. This isn't simply attachment, it's an instinctive survival mechanism. The brain is reaching for what feels familiar, stable, and safe, in a world that's beginning to dissolve around it. Eyes signs to watch. Constantly seeking out one caregiver. anxiety or panic when left alone, avoidance of social interaction with others. Bell lesson. When emotional reliance turns into dependence, it may be a cry for structure from a mind slipping into confusion. Right arrow up next. Why a birthday card, a childhood photo, or a forgotten recipe can suddenly unlock a flood of tears. 6. Drowning in the past. When sentimentality becomes overpowering, we all get a little misty-eyed flipping through old photo albums. But when those memories trigger intense, almost obsessive emotions, something deeper may be going on. Older adults with early dementia may become fixated on their childhood, rewatch old home movies endlessly, or cry over birthday cards from decades ago. They might start collecting keepsakes or recreating meals from their youth with deep urgency. This happens because dementia affects the hippocampus and amygdala, areas responsible for both memory and emotion. As they deteriorate, the line between past and present begins to blur. Imagine trying to hold on to a familiar face in a crowd that's constantly shifting. The past becomes a refuge, a place where they can still feel anchored. Brain doctor's insight. This kind of intense nostalgia isn't just reminiscing. It's the brain trying to feel real, grounded, and emotionally safe again. Eyes key indicators. Constantly retelling childhood stories. Strong emotional reactions to old objects or recipes. A need to go back, emotionally, mentally, or symbolically. Bell lesson. When memories become a lifeline, the brain may be reaching backwards to survive the present. Right arrow coming up. Sweet tooth surprises, and why they can reveal more than bad eating habits. 7. The sweet shift. When cravings get strange. One of the most bizarre, yet telling, changes in early dementia is a sudden obsession with sugar. Imagine a senior who's never liked desserts sneaking candies into their nightstand or adding syrup to meat. Sounds odd. It's not just a new habit, it's a warning. As dementia affects the orbitofrontal cortex, which helps regulate impulse control, decision-making, and taste preferences, unusual cravings can take over. The body may crave sugar not because it needs it, but because the brain is trying to stimulate pleasure pathways that no longer fire correctly. Brain doctor's insight. This is especially common in behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. Strange food pairings and late-night snacking may be neurological, not nutritional. Eyes what to notice. Binging on sweets despite health issues. Mixing foods in odd ways. Becoming possessive or sneaky with snacks. Bell lesson. When eating habits shift suddenly and dramatically, the issue may not be taste. It might be the brain's impulse regulator starting to fail. Right arrow, don't miss the next one. When routine becomes ritual and every minute matters. 8. The ritual trap. When routine becomes sacred. It's good to have a routine until that routine becomes a rulebook, one that can't be broken. If your loved one gets upset when breakfast is at 7:02 instead of 7 o'clock, or if they insist the mail must be checked before coffee every single day, it might be more than a preference. Dementia can limit the brain's ability to shift gears. When executive functions falter, predictability becomes comfort. Every repeated action is a form of control over a world that feels more and more unstable. Brain doctor's insight. This behavioral rigidity is the brain clinging to the last bit of certainty it can manage. Eyes pay attention to. Anxiety when routines are disrupted. Repetitive tasks with no flexibility. Emotional outbursts over small schedule changes. Bell lesson. When daily habits feel like survival rituals, it may be the brain's last attempt to create order from internal chaos. Right arrow, the final sign may be the hardest to see, but the most painful to experience. Don't miss what happens when emotions go silent. 9. The quiet fade. When emotions shut down. This may be the most heartbreaking change of all. A once vibrant, joyful, emotionally expressive person begins to grow quiet. Not just less talkative, but flat, unreactive, distant. The sparkle in their eyes fades. Laughter doesn't come as easily. Movies that used to make them cry? Nothing. This isn't sadness. It's apathy, a common and often misunderstood symptom of early dementia. It occurs when emotional circuits in the frontal lobe and limbic system shut down. The body is present, but the feelings, the essence of the person, seem to disappear. Brain doctor's insight. Apathy is one of the most predictive early warning signs, and yet, one of the most overlooked. Eyes look for no reaction to good or bad news. Withdrawing from meaningful conversations. Lack of interest in previously loved hobbies. Bell lesson. When someone you love begins to drift emotionally, it may not be depression. It could be a deeper neurological disconnection. Final thoughts. Lessons that matter most. These early changes in behavior aren't just medical trivia. They're emotional turning points. When caught early, they become opportunities for action, understanding, and connection. If you've made it this far in the video, here are a few takeaways we hope stay with you. White heavy check mark. Early action saves dignity. The sooner you notice and respond, the more you preserve the person you love. White heavy check mark. Behavior changes are not just personality quirks. They're signs of brain shifts that may need support, treatment, or at the very least, your loving attention. White heavy check mark. You're not alone. Many families silently struggle to make sense of these changes. Sharing stories, asking questions, and staying curious makes a difference. Red heart. If this video helped you in any way, or made you think of someone in your life, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with a friend, or leaving a comment below. Your engagement truly fuels our mission. Television. And if you want more science-backed, practical, and compassionate advice for aging well, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community here at Senior Health Tips. Because aging is a journey, and no one should have to walk it alone. Brain. And remember, knowledge is the best medicine, especially when taken early. So stay curious, stay prepared, and stay connected with us here at Senior Health Tips.